Welcome to C2G Talk, a series of one-on-one interviews with influential practitioners and thought leaders to explore the governance challenges faced by approaches such as carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation modification. I'm Janos Pasztor, Executive Director of the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, and I'm speaking today with Dr. Vera Songwe, Executive Secretary of the UN's Economic and Social Commission for Africa, also known as UNECA. UNECA has the task of promoting the economic and social development of its 54 member states, foster intra-regional integration, and promote international cooperation for Africa's development. Before joining UNECA, Ms. Songwe was the Regional Director of the International Finance Corporation, covering West and Central Africa. Prior to this, she held a number of roles at the World Bank, including serving as Country Director for Cape Verde, the Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, Mauritania, and Senegal. Ms. Songwe was also advisor to the World Bank's Managing Director for Africa, Europe, and Central and South Asia. Before joining the World Bank, she was a visiting researcher at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minnesota and at the University of Southern California. Ms. Songwe, welcome to C2G Talk.
Thank you, Janos. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today for the C2G talks. I've been looking forward to it, so thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, and I would suggest that let's start with the big question. Can you tell us about your work at the UN, ECA, and in particular, how your focus on cooperation and economic and social development is supporting countries in the region to tackle climate change?
Thank you. As you know, the UNECA, we have at the Economic Commission for Africa, we are privileged to be one of the rare institutions that works on all of Africa. And so essentially we work from, as I like to say, Algeria to Zimbabwe and Dakar to Djibouti, covering the continent. How are we working with countries to support climate change? We just came back about 2 or 3 weeks ago, early September, where we met with all the environment ministers of the continent to see how we could position sort of Africa's position going into the COP. So I think the first thing that we do is really supporting countries in getting what are the big priorities, what is the international community talking about. We are home to, of course, 33 of the 46 least developed countries. But also we have the major economies on the continent, right? South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, Morocco. And one of the things we've done for particularly South Africa, Egypt, and we're now finalizing a study for Kenya, is we've worked with Oxford University to look at, we're all suffering from the COVID pandemic. Africa has gotten its first recession in 25 years. How can we grow out of this crisis? And the work we've done with Oxford University is really to look at what does a green recovery look like? How does recovering in a climate smart way look like? And we've done quite a number of studies that show that South Africa, for example, can gain 420% more value added if it grew in a green and sustainable way, 320% more jobs, the same thing, similar numbers in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So I think what we're trying to do is really, yes, climate change is important. Yes, ensuring that countries commit to net zero by 2050 is important, but we're working with countries to say, how do you get there? And of course, part of how do you get there is the financing. And so for a lot of countries, we're also looking at how we can use the special drawing rights that have just been issued. We're part of the advocacy for the issuance of that, but now having had them, how can we use them for development? And in particular, climate smart development.
This is very interesting. And I was just wondering, the way you described it to connect building back from COVID and the climate objectives, do you see progress in the region in actually taking these ideas up?
Yes. I mean, of course, the two easiest ones are looking for renewable energy, right? Africa still has a huge energy deficit on the continent. And so looking at how one can find and do things that will crowd in the financing that is needed to put in new renewable energy is a particularly important aspect of what we do. And we see a lot of countries doing that. On the agriculture side, a lot of Africa is still rural, and 80% of those in the rural areas are active one way or another in the agriculture sector. It's again about how you use water, new agriculture technologies that can ensure that we're doing it in a green and smarter way. And there is a lot of pickup, not only because it's the right thing to do, but because it's the economic thing to do. It's more cost effective if you did actually the returns on an acre of cultivation of rice, if you did it with new sustainable energy practices, better, more optimal use of fertilizer and water, the outputs are much better. So I think when you can impact this kind of knowledge on citizens and farmers and the private sector, there is uptake for it.
Yeah, and you already mentioned the range of countries that that your region includes, from the LDC, quite a few LDCs, and also larger economies. And I'm just wondering, how do you foster more cooperative action between them? And is climate change, for example, a way to unify the countries in the region, or is it not?
Well, I think it is a way to unify the countries in the region. And let me take a very clear example. I'll take the Senegal River Valley Authority, in French is the OMVS, which brings together 5 or 6 countries on the continent, essentially for energy provision, but also for agriculture, using essentially, as it is called, the water basin, right? It's the sort of, in West Africa, that Senegal water basin. And what we you know, what those countries have succeeded in doing is using that water basin, both for agriculture, we're actually looking at it now for maritime transportation, but also for energy. And essentially, so you have Mauritania as one of them that, you know, produces quite an amount of solar energy. You have Mali that produces hydro, because a lot of the dams, Segu and the rest, are in Mali. And there is an energy sharing trade agreement. So in the dry months, we use more solar from Mauritania and Senegal. In the wet months, we use more water from Mali and Guinea. And that whole process is actually providing more collaboration. It's also reducing the cost, because each country has access to the cheapest energy supply at a particular point in time. And now we're going to put gas into that system, and, you know, you will have increasingly, and this is the power, I think, of power pools on the continent, because again, we're working towards, yes, we want to do some small renewable distributed energy facilities in more remote areas, but when you're trying to work on sort of agglomerations of cities, we're trying to bring together power pools to see how we can optimize the use of energy and water, of course, for agriculture, and in the case of the OMVS, also water for transportation, in a way that brings countries together. And I think even in times, as we've seen in the international community, right, and we're just seeing it recently with the Europeans and the price of oil going up, and, you know, Russia essentially saving the day. So even in times of crisis, Russia is under sanctions. Even in times of crisis, you see countries never really sort of sever their energy agreements, because it's so fundamental. And I think that remains a strong sort of pinpoint for creating better collaboration amongst countries.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. You may have seen the Working Group 1 report of the IPCC 6 Assessment Report that was released in August. And it acknowledges the challenges of achieving deep emission cuts and the required carbon dioxide removal to reach net zero and then net negative necessary to keep temperatures within the Paris Agreement. Depending on how each carbon dioxide removal approach, whether it's nature-based or technology-based, is applied in different geographical and social contexts, they could either contribute or hinder the achievement of sustainable development goals. So how could governance help to reduce the risks of trade-offs associated with the deployment of certain types of carbon removal approaches and maximize the benefits or synergies?
And that's a very good question, because it's one that we work on a lot. I think indeed carbon dioxide removal using nature-based solutions can have co-benefits beyond just carbon removal from the atmosphere, right? For example, one of the things that Ethiopia and many other countries in East West, actually, I think in a lot of the continent are doing, but Ethiopia championing it more than most, is trying to restore their forest. Ethiopia has this ambitious objective to plant, I think it's 30 billion trees in the next 5 years. And you know, or whether they're restoring their forests, their mangroves, biodiversity, all this is protecting against storms, but it's also protecting against silting, which allows for us to have water for our energy. I always go back to that because it's so fundamental. But there are also opportunities to build livelihoods associated with nature-based solutions. And again, in Ethiopia, for example, one of the things that we're doing is using you know, trying to see whether we can protect the trees that we've planted by creating new and better carbon stove, cooking stove alternatives, so that the citizens in different rural areas do not need to have recourse to the trees that have just recently been planted for cooking habits. So I think there are also opportunities, of course, to begin to value more natural heritage, and natural heritage, not just the physical natural heritage, but also the agriculture and the natural heritage. And we see a lot of that happening, for example, in Benin, where the whole sort of Dahomey forests are being protected to ensure, one, that citizens can come and visit, but it's also protecting the environment. In countries like Gabon, we're looking for increased value addition on locally produced timber. And IKEA is working with Gabon to see whether they can now relocate to Gabon. So it is one, using more efficient, improved technology, yes, to use some of the wood, creating more jobs, but doing it in a sustainable way. What we have seen in the past is that there hasn't been replacement of a lot of the trees that have been cut out. In that sense, carbon dioxide removal has the potential to both support the attainment of Africa's, the prosperity ambitions and the sustainable development goals, but at the same time, ensuring that we do it in a climate smart way. However, carbon dioxide removal using other technologies, including sort of removal from fossil fuels, biomass, and plants, is something that we do not, do well enough in terms of the continent, that we will need first to do some advocacy, a little bit more education. And I think one of the things that we as the ECA are doing is saying, what are the transitions that countries need to make, that populations need to make, and some of the advocacy that we need to do is really from the grassroots level on, and ensure that we can educate the younger citizens in terms of what are better and more climate smart ways. Then, of course, using more improved technologies. It's one thing when we talk about distributed renewable energy. It's another thing when we talk about smallholder farming at small scale. But if you do small scale farming, you use more water, you use more fertilizer. So I think there are some tensions in these areas that we need to understand, and then see what is the first objective that we're trying to get. What is the narrative? Is it prosperity? And then how do we marry that prosperity ambition with an ambition for smart climate and fossil fuel removal?
But precisely along the lines of what is the real objective in terms of prosperity or something else, could you see this being turned around, that where carbon dioxide removal is not just there for some climate objective, but it's actually an economic activity that becomes a driver of development with also carbon objectives? Would you see that happening in Africa?
I think it is already happening. And I think that that's a little bit for Africa. The narrative is invariably we end up with climate smart decisions. But I think those decisions need to be stimulated by a desire for a better livelihood. Mm-hmm. And so if we take, for example, the example of the villagers who live around the pitlands of the Congo Basin, they're still suffering from waterborne diseases. They don't have clean water. They don't have access to electricity. And the girls have to walk kilometers to get clean water, and they're still cutting the wood. If you go there and tell them, if you stop cutting the wood, the nature will be better off, it doesn't mean much to them. But if you say to them, we're going to sort of put a price on carbon or compensate you for protecting the forest and for cutting down the wood you need in a particular way, so we're rewarding you for something, but also giving you a protective role, it improves their livelihoods. They have maybe more nature-based housing development technologies that they can use. They can do farming differently, increase their productivity, so they need to cut less trees. And it really comes together as a better ecosystem. But the conversation there is, how do I improve your livelihoods? And in improving or through improving the livelihoods, I'm also protecting nature. I think that is essentially is really where we want the conversation on the continent to go.
Okay. Now, there are many ideas about how to achieve large-scale carbon dioxide removal, including nature and technology-based approaches, but all of them pose governance challenges and raise the issue of permanence. How can the issue of permanence of nature-based approaches be addressed in a context where important ecosystems, such as what you just mentioned, the Congo Basin rainforest, are increasingly losing their ability to absorb carbon dioxide?
That's a very good question. I think indeed the permanence of nature-based solutions is exactly the reason why we are calling for structured and meaningful financial compensation schemes for Africa stored carbon. And we talk about the pitlands. at least the part of the cuvette that has been studied, and this is part of the problem, right? We need to do more, what would I call it, more scientific exploration in some of these places, because we can still today, given the importance of a place like the peatlands, be assuming, what its contribution to carbon storage is. And so I think what we need is better compensation schemes for carbon that is stored. We think today that about 30 billion tons of carbon is stored in Congo's peatlands, but there's no reward for that. And if we can, there's not even a global, I would say, it's almost a cultural heritage spot, right? I would say that we need some global conservation program that ensures that this part of the world is protected, because if it did not exist, we may already be at on the thresholds of the 1.5 degrees warming. So my sense is we need to invest in the Sustainable Development Agenda. Has to be an agenda that is a compensatory agenda for the storage that the carbon sinks that Africa still holds and is containing. We've seen the problems in, of course, Latin America, and what the fact that we didn't do this, we didn't step in and protect. And now, the Amazon forest has become a carbon emitter, as opposed to one of the world's largest carbon sinks. So with increasing impacts on climate change, land degradation, we are already spending as a continent 5 to 11% of our GDP. So there is this, continuous call for $100 billion. I'm not, and I don't know if Linus, I'm not necessarily a believer in still the $100 billion. Africa probably has already spent $100 billion since the Paris Agreement, just reacting to climate incidents. And I think we do need to now come together and say, first of all, and Africa should not be just beggar saying, I need the resources. We have places like the Congo Basin, and this stretch all the way to Liberia and Sierra Leone, where we are actually absorbing, where huge carbon sinks, and a price on carbon that can reward some of this will really allow those countries then to be able to respond to their climate challenges. And I think that that's one of the things that we need to begin to put in the global space. We're hoping that a conversation like this will happen at COP. I know that the COP conversations are mostly around Article 6, but I think that by the time people decide to come to the conversations that really are important for Africa, we may have then lost the carbon sinks that Africa holds, and then it will be too late. So I think that really there needs to be an awakening about this tension of saying, let's wait and let's come back to some of those conversations. Having a structured way of having the countries work together is again another, and this is particularly part of the whole conversation around a new and renewed and revived multilateralism, right? A lot of these conversations, yes, we will have an Africa position, but by the time we get there, G20 countries will probably have a position, and that will be the position that predominates a lot of the negotiations. But if we have the large carbon sinks in this part of the world, then I think that this part of the world needs a seat at the table that can say, and then in addition to the carbon price, and I think this is also where we have need to maybe clarify, in the RED initiative, because there have been attempts at putting carbon a price to carbon, but you have developed firms come and sort of essentially claim the carbon sequestration that has happened on the continent, and so they are rewarded for it in the far afield shores, and the people who are actually the ones who have been sequestering and protecting that carbon don't benefit. So again, we need, I think, more transparency in these processes, rewards that go to the communities that have protected this carbon sinks through the ages, and not just a well-meaning international business that gets a carbon reward very far away, and those local communities do not even realize that they actually have stored something that is of value to humanity in general.
And thank you for raising this important issue of saving the carbon sinks in Africa, and that there is urgency about this. So, but when we talk about carbon dioxide removal, there is one issue that keeps coming up, the so-called moral hazard. The risk that, considering its deployment of carbon removal approaches, it could distract from efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And shying away from tackling that challenge bears the risk of not achieving the Paris goals. The concept of moral hazard has a long history in economics, and I'd be very interested to hear your insights as an economist as to how to overcome that problem so that society both accelerates emission cuts, is able to balance residual emissions, and then remove residual carbon from the atmosphere. all necessary actions to deliver the Paris Agreement goals according to the latest IPCC findings. So are there economic and policy tools, both being important parts of governance, which can help to reduce the moral hazard?
That's a very good question. Listen, I think, again, we are in a space, I guess we should have anticipated this, but we're in a space where even the technology is not yet where we would like it to be. And so, you know, a lot of the sort of carbon dioxide removal technologies that we are using today, we don't understand fully well what those risks are, right? And so, I mean, there's a lot of new inventions which seem like they're going to be path breakers, you know, oxygen storage, carbon dioxide capture, taking it out of the atmosphere. And so all of this sort of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage are good ideas, but deploying them at large scale would require large amounts of resources, large amounts of land that we are trying to use to create more forests for better carbon capture. So these have some consequences that we are not really clear, we're not really sure about, and we will need to do a little bit more work to see whether we can understand what are the competing tensions. Of course, today we've seen that we have what they call sort of step agriculture farming. So maybe you say, okay, I give up vast expanses of land for carbon capture while I use, you know, this new bioengineering methodologies for agriculture, but still we don't know. It's like the genetically modified foods. There's still a lot of research. So we need a frank and open conversation about, you know, what is possible, what are the costs and benefits, what are the implications. At the same time, we need some, you know, better research and development. Of course, the countries that do the research and development are those that have you know, the resources and the ability to do that. So the research and development they do, which then is applied in many cases to the emerging market economies, may not necessarily be things that are location or geography appropriate. And so I think that is a little bit also where you have these issues of moral hazard in terms of, you know, yes, it may be a good technology in California, but it may not necessarily be a good technology in Benin or in the Congo Basin. But, you know, if I'm going to gain my carbon credits because I said that I did something in Benin or Congo and I'm being rewarded in California, the consequences of that, you know, never emerge until much later in Benin. And you know, everybody has moved on. So we do need, I think, and I think that's why people like Makani are calling for better, more transparency and more targets and more. Actually, right now we have it's always been self-regulation, right, of a lot of the CDR methodologies, and I think it would be important to create some unified platform where these are discussed again and some agreement on what kind of R&D, where can it be used, so that we understand first of all the dimensions of CDR, but also the consequences of it.
Let's talk a little bit about temperature. Even in the low emission scenario of the last IPCC report, which includes net zero emissions around or after 2050, and the use of carbon dioxide removal to deliver the required net removal after that till the end of the century, the report estimates that there will be a temporary overshoot beyond 1.5 degrees. How does the African region, which hosts some of the most vulnerable countries to climate change, plan to address the impacts of such an overshoot?
So we think that, again, going back to the conversation we just had, the overshoot is really as a result of, you know, emissions from the advanced economies. And so I think that part of the conversation must be, you know, what are the advanced economies doing? And so our first attempt at resolution of some of these issues is really going to be saying, you know, what are the developed countries doing? You know, when we look at emissions, for example, right, the United States emits somewhere in the order of 399 billion tons of carbon. Europe emits somewhere in the order of 353 billion tons of carbon. Russia, 101 billion. India, 48 billion. Africa, you know, 43. So if you just look at, you know, 399 from the United States, 353 from Europe, and Africa at 43 billion tons, 2.7% of global carbon emissions come from the continent. So I think we do need to sort of say, you know, who is overshooting? Of course, China is 200 billion. You can't talk about carbon emissions without talking about China, which is a close third in the sort of global carbon emissions. If you take the whole of Europe, you know, it's 514 billion. They will be number one if you take all of Europe in terms of carbon emissions. So we do need to have, I think, a different kind of conversation. And I kind of have a particular, you know, if again, like we said, if you come to the continent and you just talk about, you know, what do we need to do or what does Africa need to do, we also need to understand that Africa can only, I think, sustainably and justly do, you know, have the conversation on carbon emissions if Africa is seeing that this road is a road to a more prosperous life, if Africa is seeing that this is a road to better livelihoods and meeting the SDGs. And I think in that context, then we need, you know, strong support for, you know, how can we adapt and build resilience? Where are those resources coming from? Where are we going to get? It's not enough to just tell Africa, stop, stop, stop. We have to be able to say to Africa, these are resources that you can use to do better. Now, those resources, again, should not only and necessarily be resources that are aid, and that's where this carbon price becomes important. You know, we need to give Africa its due for preserving some part of the climate in a way that has not been done by many others. And so you have the African Climate Resilient Investment Facility, the AfriRes, for example, with the World Bank, the African Union, and the Nordic Fund. We are working with all of these different institutions, one, to help support African countries build resilience, understand where, you know, critical emissions are coming from, and then where the transport ecosystems are also coming from. So I think we do need to have some of those. I don't have any numbers. I mean, this is all literature here. I don't. So we do need to understand where the numbers are coming, where Africa is coming from, and then ensure that we can respond to it in a sustainable way.
Thank you. And continuing with the temperature issue. So there are right now the trends are that the global temperatures will go above 1.5 degrees centigrade, possibly beyond 2 and even beyond that, depending on how well the world does emission reductions. And there are emerging ideas to actually directly lower temperatures by reflecting more sunlight into space in order to reduce the risks of overshooting temperature goals, such as through solar radiation modification. This includes ideas to brighten marine clouds and even to spray reflective aerosols into the stratosphere. How and in what forum might decision makers consider the risks and benefits, as well as the governance challenges and opportunities posed by these approaches, compared to the expected impacts of climate change? How could Africa bring justice and equity considerations to the table in global discussions about solar radiation modification?
I think, and I like the fact that you're using the words equity and justice. I actually have a third one that I like to add to that couple is equity, justice, and transparency. And I think in some sense that you need the three to be able to really bring a conversation, to have a useful and meaningful conversation around the debate on solar radiation modification. Because one, you know, we have to be very careful first about, you know, climate change alerting technologies, especially when we do not understand their consequences. Is a question of, you know, looking at, you know, where we're using these technologies. A lot of these technologies are very novel, and understanding what the impact is around these technologies. We just talked about the peatlands of the Congo and the fact that today we don't even know, you know, what is the sort of, what are the numbers, you know, how much carbon has been sequestered, what is the size? I mean, I'm quite appalled actually at the sort of lack of numbers in this field. I kind of almost begin to think that we're talking a lot out of sort of putting our hand in the wind. At least that's my perception. And so if we cannot even establish peatlands that have lasted for 10,000 years, what exactly are they doing? Very difficult to know when you start doing carbon seeding that's just started 5 years ago, what is going to be its impact? And since a lot of that technology is being tested in the emerging markets, what does that imply for our agriculture? What does that imply for our livelihoods? We're beginning to see a lot of change in zoonotic diseases. In East Africa, we just recently went through huge spates of locusts that came in the wrong season. Is that because we're also changing weather patterns, very difficult to say. So I think some transparency on where some of these technologies are being used, how long they've been used, what has been the impact in those areas, and hence, if Ethiopia or any other country, for example, wants to do cloud seeding, what then are the mitigating measures that it has to put in place, and ensuring that they pass some ISO standard will be an important part of the conversation.
Do you see any debate in the Africa region about these new techniques of solar radiation
No, there are no
modification?
debates. I don't think they are. Yeah, I think each country, and that's why you need some multilateral space to have the conversations. My sense is each country is often experimenting on it with partners from the developed world that are trying to use it.
Maybe as we're coming to the end of this interview, I could ask a personal question to you. It's been a tough year, a bit longer than a year, in fact, with the COVID pandemic, lack of vaccines in Africa, the growing impacts of climate change, economic challenges, rising tensions between world powers. Added to this, the constraints of you being an international civil servant. How do you maintain a sense of enthusiasm and optimism, even while acknowledging the gravity of the problems? What philosophies or anything else help you guide in your thinking and in your behavior?
No, I mean, I think it's always the thought that, if we can change a few policies, we can always improve the lives of a few. And given the as you said, the desperate situation in which COVID has put many of our economies, I think trying to work to see how one gets them out of a crisis is really, the objective, to ensure that we can improve on better healthcare, find better technologies, better ways, and do that while we, of course, create jobs. We need peace on our continent, and we know that without jobs, with rising inflation, instability then is beginning to knock at the door. And that is why this conversation on climate change needs to be a conversation that goes through providing better livelihoods, providing jobs, creating environments that are more sustainable and more prosperous, so that you can create a semblance, at least, of the ambition of reaching the 2030 goals. So yeah, that's what keeps us busy. And we're making some progress, and every time you make a little bit of progress, you believe you're getting closer to the goal.
Dr. Vera Songwe, thank you very much for participating in this C2G Talk interview.
Thank you very much.